There we go. Good evening. All right. Welcome everyone to the President's Lecture Series. This lecture is part of the Year of Civility theme here at Shepherd University, and the Year of Civility is a collaboration between Shepherd University and the Stubblefield Institute, focusing on civil discussion and action while addressing diverse ideas and complex issues. Tonight, we are thrilled to hear from Peter Loge. Peter's the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, where he is also director of the Project on Ethics in Political Communications, as well as an associate professor. Peter has more than 30 years of experience working in politics and strategic communication, and he has served on the senior staff positions for 3 members of the U.S. House and a senator, in addition to serving as a presidential appointee at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. He has been integrally involved in advising candidates, issue campaigns, and public and private sector organizations. Peter regularly appears in national and international media, and his articles have appeared in The Hill, Campaigns and Elections, the Drake Law Review, and elsewhere. His book, Soccer Thinking for Management Success, Lessons for Organizations from the World's Game, debuted as a #1 new release on Amazon. His edited volume, Political Communication Ethics, Theory and Practice, is the only textbook to bring together chapters from academic and political practitioners. Peter is a senior fellow at the Aguirre Lendacaria Center in the Basque Country in northern Spain, an associate fellow at Timothy Dwight College at Yale University, and a member of the Board of Advisors at the Stubblefield Institute for Civil Political Communications here at Shepherd University. Please join me in welcoming Peter Loge.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. All of you who've done this sort of thing before know that you write your own intro, right? This was lifted from my official bio. And whenever this happens, I spend a chunk of the time thinking, just please stop talking. and the rest of the time thinking, but where was page 2? It is an honor to be here. I am excited. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, President Hendricks. Thank you, Bill and Bonnie Stubblefield. Thank you also for all you do for Shepherd and for promoting civil, sane, reasonable, grown-up political discourse. The fact that we're even talking about it matters, and I think that the part of my conversation this evening will be how we talk matters, and that you're encouraging, frankly, just doing it better is a big deal. And as I was saying on the way in, your commitment to Shepherd is an inspiration to all of us who went to smaller schools that maybe not be so popular, a lot of people have heard of, to say, you can make a difference, and you are making a difference. And I see that on campus, and I live it when I come and work with you at the Stubblefield Institute. So thank you both very much for that. So the title of my talk, so I would normally wander. It's going to be a little weird, but this is a long conversation, and I've got a small brain, so I had to write all of it down. The title of my talk asks the question, what political rhetoric is democracy? And the answer is either, obviously, everything, or it's a trick question because they're the same thing. I'll get to that explanation shortly. Before I do that, I want to start with the elephant in the room, as well as the donkey in the room, the whale carcass, or bear cub, whatever Kennedy's doing these days, in the room as well. There's something like 500,000 elected officials in the United States, ranging from town councils, school boards, local municipal offices, state legislators, governors, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and of course the president. More than 100 people have registered with the Federal Elections Commission to run for president this year. I should be more precise. More than 100 people whose first name begins with the letter A have registered with the FEC to run for president this year. Here in West Virginia, you've got 55 counties, each of which has 3 elected commissioners. The exception is Jefferson County, which has 5. Each county has a clerk, an assessor, a sheriff, and a board of education. Each education board has 5 members. The state has 232 incorporated places, most, if not all of which, have their own elected officials. Not every elected official is up at the same time. Not every campaign is contested. Nevertheless, that is a lot of politics. The campaigns to which I imagine most of you are paying attention are the governor and Senate race here in West Virginia, the Senate race just across the border in Maryland, and of course the campaign between former President Trump and Vice President Harris. In many ways, this is an election like no other. If Trump were elected, he would be the second president elected to non-consecutive terms, the first impeached president reelected, the first convicted felon elected, and I believe the first Floridian. I fact-checked almost everything in my speech. I did not get around to fact-checking that, but I'm pretty confident we haven't had a Floridian. If Vice President Harris were elected, she would be the first woman, the second person of color, and the first nominee from the Democratic Party selected by party insiders without having to face the voters first. It's also a TikTok presidential election. Do with that what you will. Just putting that out there. It's a shockingly expensive election. The Harris campaign has raised more than $1 billion. That's 9 zeros. The President of the United States makes roughly $400,000 a year. Kamala Harris would have to be president for roughly 2,500 years to make $1 billion. Put that in perspective, the governor here in West Virginia makes about $150,000 a year. Patrick Morrisey, the Republican candidate, who's probably going to get elected, last I saw had raised about $6.5 million, a little bit more than that. Put in further perspective, here's where I dive into dicey waters. Do it early. I'm going to make enemies early. The Neil Brown, Mountaineers head coach, took a minor pay cut to make roughly $4 million a year. If budgets are reflections of values, I feel like there's a lot to unpack here, but I'm just the political guy, so I'm sidestepping that one. In many ways, however, this campaign isn't new at all. We've seen this campaign before in many ways. Nativist anti-immigrant rhetoric is as old as the Republic. That some Americans hate others because of what they look like, what language they speak, how they pray, who they love, isn't new. Who they hate changes. Irish, Catholics, Italians, Jews, Basques, Chinese, you name it, someone has organized a campaign, a hate campaign against them. Political violence isn't new. We've had election riots, union busting riots. We've had anarchist riots. In the mid-1800s, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina walked onto the floor of the U.S. Senate and beat a U.S. senator nearly to death with a gold-tipped cane because the Massachusetts senator gave an impassioned speech against slavery. The senator recovered. The congressman was reelected. Outrageous political insults aren't new. In the campaign of 1800, the Hartford Courant, which is a big deal newspaper at the time, said that if Thomas Jefferson were elected president, the streets would run with blood. The president of Yale University, I've spent a lot of time at it. Your campus is roughly is prettier than Yale's, I have to be honest. And so the president of Yale University, a guy named the Reverend Timothy Dwight, said that if Thomas Jefferson were elected president, our wives and daughters would be subject to legal prostitution. Right. Even our approach to social media isn't new. In The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn, a really terrific and landmark book about early American political thought. I'm looking at the chair of the political science department for, thank you. I'm just going to do this a lot. I feel like it's just an oral exam, basically, for me at this point. Bernard Bailyn argues that the real driver of the American Revolution wasn't the shooting. It was the pamphlets and the rhetoric that came beforehand. Bailyn wrote, quoting George Orwell, the students in the room, you have all lied to your professors about having read George Orwell before. Now's a good time to catch up. The pamphlet George Orwell has written is a one-man show. One has complete freedom of expression, including, if one chooses, the freedom to be scurrilous, abusive, and seditious, or on the other hand, to be more detailed, serious, and highbrow than is ever possible in a newspaper or in most kinds of periodicals. At the same time, since the pamphlet is always short and unbound, it can be produced much more quickly than a book, and in principle, at any rate, can reach a bigger public. Above all, the pamphlet does not have to follow any prescribed pattern. It can be in prose or in verse. It can consist largely of maps or statistics or quotations. It can take the form of a story, a fable, a letter, an essay, a dialogue, or a piece of reportage. All that is required of it is that it shall be topical, polemical, and short. You take out the word pamphlet and put in social media, and it's the same argument. American politics wasn't puppies and rainbows until social media came along and suddenly the wheels came off. American politics has always been kind of a mess. It's run by people. And people, usually for better, sometimes for worse, tend to behave as if they were people. In the face of it, it's tempting to throw up our hands. Politicians will be politicians. To the heck with them. I'm going back to TikTok videos. That would be a mistake for a lot of reasons, some of which involve TikTok, some of which involve checking out. A lot of what I highlighted was before the Civil War. People got hurt. People got killed as a result of this rhetoric because of this hatred. People are diminished. We weren't as full and free as we could have been as a country because of this hatred. Saying that hate happens isn't an excuse to sit still. Our politics has been better. I grew up in politics. I came to work in the United States. I've worked for, my first boss in Congress was in the district office in Arizona in the early 1990s. I moved to Washington to work in the US Senate in 1995. Worked for a Democratic senator. The Republican senator on a hall knew all of our names staff, all of our staff names. It's been better, and it can be better again. It'll be better only if we make it better. It doesn't happen, it's on us. One of the things that has changed is the speed and reach of the garbage. Social media, bots, outside foreign actors, and others have made bad worse. They've accelerated it, they've spread it, it is therefore more dangerous, it is more nefarious, it is more dastardly. This election is both unprecedented and more of the same, only more so. Whether we get better or worse, where we go from here before the polls close and when the next president is hopefully peacefully sworn in, it's up to us. Which brings me to the question I asked at the beginning. What does political rhetoric owe democracy? And to explain why it's either obviously everything or it's a tautology, I want to work to some definitions of terms. I workshop this a bit at dinner, so some of this will sound familiar, Madam President. I just do the alphabet on the roof of your mouth with your tongue or something that gets to a boring part. That's what I do in my student presentations. I do not do that. I don't do that. I pay close attention to my students, so far as you know. The first big word in my question is, the first big word is rhetoric. A lot of people complain that too much of our politics is just rhetoric. Speeches are just rhetoric. Campaigns are just rhetoric. Candidates just spew rhetoric. This view echoes complaints of philosophers dating back at least to Socrates. I promised to name check Socrates. In his dialogues, which were more or less dramatic enactments of conversations between Socrates and his foil of the day, Plato, via Socrates, beat up on rhetoric and rhetoricians a lot. He compared it to mere cookery. Rhetoric was meant to excite the soul by use of language. In a dialogue called the Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates ask the sophist Phaedrus, if a speech is to be classified as excellent, does that not presuppose knowledge of the truth about the subject of the speech in the mind of the speaker? Phaedrus, the sophist, replies, but I have been told, my dear Socrates, that what a budding orator needs to know is not what is really right, but what is likely to seem right in the eyes of the mass of the people who are going to pass judgment. Not what is really good or fine, but what will seem so. It is this rather than truth that produces conviction, which is a reasonably good definition of generative AI. For Plato, teaching people to become, quote, a man of real power in the city, both as a speaker and a man of action, which is to say the art of politics, his words. Protagoras claims to do that, risk poisoning the soul. Here, Plato wasn't engaging in a clever metaphor of poisoning the soul. That wasn't Plato's thing. He literally meant it. He said, knowledge is food of the soul, and if you don't understand knowledge, you will poison yourself. He compared going to a teacher to going to a market and buying food or meat. Right? All of you have done this at some point in your life. You pull something out of the fridge and you say to your roommate, does this taste bad? And they take a swill and they spit it out. Yes, it tastes awful. I say, thanks so much. I want to have any of that. Right? For Plato, knowledge was the same thing. It was literally poisoning the soul if you didn't know the truth. At one point, in one of his dialogues, Plato pointed out to the sophists that if somebody was really persuasive but didn't know anything about medicine, and he was debating with somebody who was a doctor but not very persuasive, the doctor would lose the argument, and the person who didn't know about medicine but sounded compelling would actually get people to do things that were bad for them. Very 2020 vibe about Plato's insight there. The challenge for Plato was knowing the truth. That's capital T, it's written this way. You can't, I said no slides, otherwise I'd show you. There's capital T. This anti-rhetoric strain has been going strong ever since. The Roman orator Quintilian complained about hack advocates, his phrase, hack advocates. Our founders were equally skeptical and cautious. Before he was a song and dance man, Alexander Hamilton had a career in politics. I love that some of you got that. That was really funny a few years ago when Hamilton was all the thing. Google it later. not now. Right. At any rate, Alexander Hamilton, he was one of 3 authors of the Federalist Papers, which are basically political ads for this crazy new idea called the U.S. Constitution. In the first Federalist paper, Hamilton wrote, "And a further reason for caution in this respect might be drawn from the reflection that we are not always sure that those who advocate the truth are influenced by purer principles than their antagonists. Ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more than laudable than these are apt to operate as well upon those who support as those who oppose the right side of a question. Were there not even these inducements to moderation, nothing could be more ill-judged than that intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. For in politics as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution." Closer to our time, in his essay, Politics in English Language, is George Orwell. I told you we'd come back to Orwell. You have been warned about that one. Orwell took turns beating a dead horse, in part by complaining about overused metaphors like beating a dead horse. He also complained about words that have become meaningless with overuse. Words like democracy, socialism, freedom, patriotic, realistic, and justice. His examples, not mine. In the same essay, he complained that in our time it is broadly true that political writing is bad writing. The political speech is largely in defense of the indefensible and is meant to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. This was in 1946, when things were going reasonably well. Not long after Orwell, the American rhetorical scholar and conservative public intellectual Richard Weaver defined rhetoric as truth plus its artful presentation. Here he was following not only Plato in appealing to a deeper good, again, capital G, it's written here that way. He was also echoing Cato, who'd been quoted by Quintilian and others, saying that rhetoric was good men speaking well. Good does a lot of work here. True eloquence requires, for Cato, Quintilian, Weaver, and others, an understanding of the good. That understanding was necessary to be a good orator. In 1963, Richard Weaver, in lamenting the demise of classical rhetorical education, in which the good reasons, good soul was part of the education, lamenting its demise, saying that beginners, part-time teachers, graduate students, faculty wives, and various fringe people are now the instructional staff of an art which was once supposed to require outstanding gifts and mature experience. And indulge me a little bit of a sidebar here because you're kind of stuck, you have to. I was an adjunct instructor at the George Washington University for a long time, and I assigned Richard Weaver. And at the time, my lovely young wife was a member of the Board of Trustees at GW, making me both a faculty spouse and a part-timer. And many would argue a fringe person. What was left off of my bio was that I lobbied for America's Funniest Home Videos. So I have a special place in my heart for Richard Weaver. All of those things are alarmingly true. The late Washington Post columnist Meg Greenfield summed it up well in 1984. Rhetoric, in short, is widely considered a sin. I should note this was in an essay called In Defense of Rhetoric. On it goes. The problem with Plato and his progeny is the assumption of truth or good. These were not fans of democracy. They think that only the people who know things, who have access to what is really right or really true, should be allowed to speak or teach others to speak. Speaking well for them wasn't just the tricks. It wasn't just the cadence and the intonation and the repetition and all of that. It was knowing the nature of the good, which coincidentally, they knew. Plato thought philosopher kings should rule. What a happy coincidence that Plato considered himself a philosopher king. It's amazing to me how when people who insist that only the righteous should lead define themselves as righteous. The rest of us are misguided, muddled, victims of faculty wives and other fringe people. It's tempting to agree with Plato, Orwell, and Weaver and everyone else who accuses of others of being hack advocates. I think that a lot. Right? As a teacher and a practitioner of the art of politics, I can't be the problem. I'm a good guy. Somebody introduced me as being nice at dinner. I'm just saying. It's not me. The problem is all those other knuckleheads who don't agree with my obviously right answers and compelling arguments. It's all of you not laughing at my jokes. You're the problem. There's more laughter on that one. The problem is for people who don't do the readings. Students should do the readings. And if you're not in my class, you should have done the readings anyway. I'm going to sign them later. The problem with this approach is pretty clear, if somewhat humbling. I might be wrong. You might be wrong. That's the thing about people. We're sometimes wrong. Democracy is premised on each of us being wrong sometimes and none of us having all the right answers all of the time. That's the point. Enter another definition of rhetoric. If you think about it, politics can't be anything other than rhetoric. Of course, campaign speeches and politics are rhetoric. What else are they going to be? Odds are good that any definition of politics you come up with will relatively closely match somebody else's definition of rhetoric. Aristotle, another name check, whose book, The Art of Rhetoric, is basically everything you need to know about how to be persuasive. You could save yourself a lot of time and heartache just by slogging your way through Aristotle's rhetoric. Defined rhetoric as the art of discovering all of the available means of persuasion in a given situation. He further delineated three kinds of speech: forensic, which is truth-seeking, like forensic medicine; epidictic, which is speeches in praise or blame, like wedding toasts, which are often praise and blame, depending on the wedding; and deliberative. Deliberative speech is political speech. It's what we should do into the unknown. That's what we're talking about tonight. Deliberative rhetoric is towards something. It's an argument meant to get people to agree to a course of action. Rhetoric isn't a threat or an order. It's about persuasion. You use rhetoric to persuade your friends to go for burgers rather than pizza. It takes creativity, maybe making a deal to get pizza next time or extolling the virtues of Blue Moon over Tommy's. I know I'm wading into something here. It's just an example. I applaud Tommy's for raising money for the hurricane victims. They're good. I'm sure they're good people. I've been to Blue Moon. They're very nice too. I'm just saying, if you want to get somebody to go to one or the other, that involves a level of rhetoric. To say that political speeches shouldn't be full of rhetoric is to say that Blue Moon burgers shouldn't be full of burger, basically. It is what it is. We try to persuade each other all the time. As Aristotle wrote, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. Ordinary people do this either at random or through practice and from acquired habit. I'm trying to persuade you here tonight that how we talk about politics matters. Your professors try to persuade you to do the readings, to push yourself intellectually, to challenge yourself. Your partners try to persuade you to spend less time watching soccer on weekends and maybe paint the front porch already. And you then try to persuade your partner that, in fact, watching soccer is a good way to decompress and you can learn things from it, and the porch is going to get painted and it's too cold out now because we're getting freezing at night. And she tries to persuade you that the couch is so lovely you could... Sorry. It's been a long week. I may... drifting off topic a bit. The point is, rhetoric is what we do to figure out the best way to approach an unknown and unknowable future. We do not and we cannot know the one true best course of action. The world is too complicated. There are too many variables. And one of the variables is that the world is made up of people. And people collectively are weird. We can't possibly know the best right thing to do next. The best we can do is to try to reason together, to talk and to persuade, to marshal evidence and appeal to emotion, to speak as and to the whole person, to find the best course of action. In this view, being together is to have a conversation. We're constantly negotiating and speculating, urging and conceding, listening and learning. That last bit's important. Listening and learning. In his 2006 book, Saving Persuasion, A Defense of Rhetoric and Judgment, Yale University professor Brian Garstin wrote, "A politics of persuasion in which people try to change one another's minds by appealing not only to reason but also to passions and sometimes even prejudices is a mode of politics worth defending. Persuasion is worthwhile because it requires us to pay attention to our fellow citizens and to display a certain respect for their points of view and to their judgments." Several years later, in the Annual Review of Political Science, Garstin wrote about a rhetoric revival in political theory. The revival for Garstin was driven in part by the failure of deliberative democratic theorists and advocates like Jürgen Habermas, who often claimed that rhetoric was the enemy of reason. In the later piece, Garstin quotes John Dewey, one of the most important American philosophers, one of the most important philosophers of America, as writing, "The essential need in mass democracies is the improvement of the methods and conditions of debate, discussion, and persuasion." Dewey wrote this in 1927. In the view of the writers and scholars stretching at least from Protagoras, who told Socrates that he thought the art of told Socrates who taught the art of politics, through Garston, who gives exams about Protagoras, Aristotle, and the art of politics at Yale today, rhetoric has been central to the democratic process. I'm going to go a step further. And I'd argue that in constructing our politics, rhetoric also constructs our polity. We talked the United States into existence. I'm from Connecticut. Grew up relatively near Plymouth Rock. The Pilgrims didn't stumble across a box of democracy. Right? They didn't fall into a chasm of democratic debate. Our democracy was cobbled together with ideas borrowed and stolen from the English, the Swiss, the Basques, the Iroquois, and more. Hamilton, Jefferson, Adams, and the others cut deals. They cajoled opponents, reassured supporters, and talked our nation into being. The Aztecs declared what is now Mexico City the capital of the Aztec Empire because of a prophecy said to settle where they saw an eagle eating a snake perched on top of a cactus. Washington, D.C. is the U.S. capital as a result of a deal to get southern states to agree that the new nation should pay Revolutionary War debts. Our nation isn't a new geography of an old church, and there are no Roman walls. We're the result of pirates, thieves, visionaries, religious outcasts, slave traders, entrepreneurs, utopians, lost sailors, and desperate dreamers from all over the world. Our nation is a result of bold ideas and rhetorical flourishes. As John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1815, near the end of both of their lives, that fought among the most vicious political campaigns in American history in 1800, and they later reconciled. Adams wrote to Jefferson near the end of their lives, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. The records of 13 legislatures, the pamphlets, newspapers, and all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. America was invented by deeply flawed, very smart, rhetorically skilled visionaries and political entrepreneurs. As the AP's Ted Anthony wrote after this year's Democratic and Republican National Conventions, Americans live in one of the only societies that's built not upon hundreds of years of common culture, but upon stories themselves. In some ways, the United States willed itself into existence and significance by iterating and reiterating its story as it went. The identity of a nation, like our personal identity, is a matter of assembling parts that seem to make sense. Parts that fit, parts that provide an understanding of our history to explain our present and guide us into an uncertain future. One of President Obama's speechwriters, Ben Rhodes, wrote that every nation is a story. It's almost never a simple one, and the story's meaning is usually contested. National identity itself depends upon how we tell the story about our past, our present moment, and our future. In the words of Jody Walwork and John Dixon in the British Journal of Social Psychology in 2004, nations are imagined entities possessing a geographic and historical reality that somehow exceeds their human membership. This reality is constructed through language. As rhetorical scholar M. Lane Bruner put it, national identity is incessantly produced through rhetoric. In his 1975 article, In Search of the People, A Rhetorical Alternative, Michael McGee argued that one begins with the understanding that political myths are purely rhetorical phenomena, ontological appeals constructed from artistic proofs and intended to redefine an uncomfortable and oppressive reality. Such myths are endemic in the human condition. Though technically they represent nothing but a false consciousness, they nonetheless function as means of providing social unity and collective identity. The people are the social and political myths they accept. The United States is, at its core, rhetorical, which leads to my understanding of democracy. At its most basic, democracy is a form of government that relies on the consent of the governed. There are direct democracies, parliamentary democracies, constitutional democracies, democratic republics, and so on and so on. These definitions are variations on a theme of how decisions get made, who gets to make the decisions, and how those decision makers are chosen. The U.S. is, of course, not a direct democracy. We're more democratic today than at any point in their history, give or take some attempts to, subvert votes in various places. But we all aren't, we're better than ever before, but we're not all voting, and not all votes count the same. A little bit of political history. In 1776, New Jersey gave women the right to vote. In 1807, they took it away. In 1789, only white male landowners over the age of 21 could vote. Catholics, Jews, and Quakers were barred from voting in some states. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, gives citizenship to formerly enslaved people, but that didn't mean they were allowed to vote. Whites in power found all sorts of ways to prevent African Americans from exercising political power, especially after the era of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. In 1876, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans weren't citizens and therefore couldn't vote. Until the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913, U.S. senators were elected by state legislators rather than by the people. Women weren't given the right to vote until 1920, just over 100 years ago. Residents of Washington, D.C., where I live, weren't allowed to vote for president until 1961. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned practices that prevented or discouraged African Americans from voting. 1965, the year I was born. 18-year-olds were given the right to vote in 1971. Even as the U.S. is getting more democratic, there are still undemocratic elements baked into the system. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of how many people live in the state. That was part of the compromise, part of the deal that led to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Regardless of what one thinks of the logic, the result is, at least in the early 21st century, it skews the system in favor of Republicans. Odds are very good Republicans will retake the U.S. Senate next Tuesday. Those 51 or so U.S. senators will represent a minority of American voters. Just by the numbers of people who live in various states, odds are pretty good the Democrats will represent tens of millions of more Americans than Republicans will in the U.S. Senate. The Republicans will have more say over policy. It's a similar story of the White House and Electoral College. The last Republican president to receive a majority of the popular vote was George W. Bush in 2004. The last one before that was his father, George H.W. Bush, in 1988. Presidents Bush in 2000 and Trump in 2016 lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. There's about an even chance that's going to happen again next week. Gerrymandering skews the system even further. We have a system in which elected officials in many ways get to choose their voters rather than reverse. There are countless local elections, ballot initiatives, referenda, and more that are closer to one person, one vote. Democracy, defined as majority rule, is alive and well and thriving. Just not everywhere, and just not for everyone or at every level. However defined, structured, or imperfect, democracy should more or less give people the ability to throw the bums out, complain about whatever they want without getting thrown in jail or beaten up, and allow for its own continued existence. At some point, the people have to stop arguing and vote. Once the vote is held, the country or county or community or city or faculty committee, heaven help us, or has to do whatever the majority said to vote on. Then you argue some more and you go vote again. This time next year, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will be your president, whether you voted for them or not. Your bumper sticker that says, "Not my president," is wrong. My Democratic friends will put that on their cars. If Trump wins, they're wrong. My Republican friends will put it on their cars. If Harris wins, they are wrong. The President of the United States is the President of the United States, whether you vote for him or not. Its definition of democracy is important, and the undemocratic parts of our past and our present matter, but it's incomplete. The traditional motto of the U.S. is e pluribus unum, out of many one. Political philosopher and one-time Democratic candidate for governor of Massachusetts, Danielle Allen. I'm a complete fanboy for Danielle Allen. Any Danielle Allen fans in the crowd? I feel like I lost you all with Hamilton. She's terrific. Smart. You know, she's like accomplished, brilliant writer, writes for Washington Post and The Atlantic, best-selling books, popular books, political books, doctoral dissertation on Plato, and I just know in my heart that her children are like good at tennis and play viola or something. Allen has written, "I seek not one people or one America, but a whole people. The metaphor of wholeness can guide us into conversation about how to develop habits of citizenship that can help a democracy bring trustful coherence out of division without erasing or suppressing difference." She further wrote that democracy is based on the proposition that all human beings are amenable to persuasion and capable of decision-making achieved through persuasive language. The institutions of democracy imply this proposition regardless of whether all a democracy's citizens agree with it. If democratic citizens are to live up to the proposition implied by their institutions, they cannot give up using conversation to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes in any case whatsoever. We describe our current political situation as one in which force is not merely necessary, but also available means of instrument. This contradicts core principles that ought to be the basis of our habits. Allen, in a remarkable piece in The Atlantic several years ago, asked the question at the beginning of the piece, how could an African-American woman, who is the, I think, great-granddaughter of someone who was enslaved, be such a passionate supporter of American democratic ideals? And she said that if you find an emerald in when mucking out the stables, you don't throw it away because of where you found it. You clean it and you polish it. Democracy is a conversation about what to do next. It's loud. It can be raucous. It can be unruly. But it's a conversation. It's a means of structuring conflict without the use of force. You don't win democracy any more than competing swimmers win water. You can lose democracy if we shut down debate, if we delegitimize or demonize our opponents and baselessly attack the process. The moment someone says, you don't need to vote because we're pretty sure we know what people would do or who they would vote for, democracy's begun to fail. The moment we say one person alone has all of the answers and that disagreement is illegitimate and that those who disagree should be punished, democracy begins to fail. The moment we excuse violence, we weaken democracy, and the moment we resort to violence, we threaten democracy's existence. The moment we stop talking, stop arguing, stop cajoling, and stop persuading, democracy is over. Rather than e pluribus unum, a better motto might be out of many, a conversation. I would say that in Latin, but that would be pretentious. And I have no idea how. I have no idea. The point is we don't need to be one. We simply have to agree to keep talking. Democracy doesn't exist outside of our own agreement that it should exist, even when it's really frustrating and doesn't go our way. Another way to put it is the point of democracy is democracy. Democracy is an ongoing discussion about what to do next. It's citizens discovering all the available means of persuasion in a given situation, which is to say political rhetoric is democracy. Democracy is how we get each other to do things without resorting to violence, threats, or intimidation. Democracy doesn't exist beyond our collective agreement that it exists and our shared commitment to its continued existence. If all this is right, or more or less plausible, we need to consider what kind of rhetoric is good for democracy, what kind of a rhetoric helps democracy work well and what undermines it. At a bare minimum, we need a rhetoric that's logically sound and emotionally compelling. We need a rhetoric that unites rather than divides, that reinforces common identity and articulates shared goals, even as it argues for one approach over another. As advocates for our positions or our candidates, we need to also be advocates for the democratic rhetoric and therefore democracy itself. Democratic political rhetoric, as a version of Aristotelian deliberative rhetoric, is always about what's next. Democracy never fully is. Democracy is always becoming. So let's talk about what good democratic rhetoric looks like. A few minutes ago, I argued that the U.S. is a rhetorical construction. It's a story about itself. There are borders, and borders matter. A shared currency, a road that doesn't change as I drive back to D.C. tonight, that matters. Free trade across state lines. The fact that electricity is generated here that I consume back home in Adams Morgan, that matters. But a country isn't a map. And even the map itself was contested. In 2017, the border between North Carolina and South Carolina changed. In 2002, Arizona and California changed their borders. The U.S. and Canada are currently engaged in an ongoing border dispute. All that stuff matters, but, you know, it's a little squishy around the edges. Maps, banking regulations, pavement don't make the U.S. what it is, any more than a roof and a kitchen make a house a home. What matters is the story. The rhetoric of our nation is what differentiates the U.S. from a complicated set of financial transactions. It gives meaning to those transactions. It gives meanings to our shared community. It's why we're here tonight. It's a beautiful Monday evening in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And you're here because the conversation about democracy is important. The rhetoric of our nation is I haven't devoted a career to politics because I love receptions with lobbyists. It's an entire industry based on cheese cubes and bad cold broccoli. I haven't devoted a career to working in places where I take turns getting yelled at by constituents and then yelled at by my boss. I spent most of my life volunteering on campaigns and working in politics because I believe in the idea of an American ideal. The same is true for most of the people I've met over the decades: Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Green, whatever. Some of them are venal, selfish, and awful human beings. People are people. But most people, most of the time, work in politics because we believe in the promise of the United States of America. Right, onto the rhetoric, the story we tell. First part is to recognize the United States has never lived up to its own promise. The man who wrote "All men are created equal" owned slaves. The land in which most of us live was stolen from Native Americans who were here before the Europeans arrived. During World War II, we rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in camps. Today, there are people who say that some of their fellow citizens are unworthy of the promise of America. All of that is true. Yet, the promise matters. And we've been more or less lurching towards that promise for 250 years. Our political rhetoric needs to keep moving towards that promise. In July of 2020, in the middle of the last overheated presidential election, I wrote a piece for an outlet called The Fulcrum, arguing for a political rhetoric of a humble civil religion. I opened the essay. I was just going to cut and paste this in, but then I realized I would actually be plagiarizing myself, so I'm footnoting myself, which is a weird, both grossly egotistical, very meta, but I feel like I'm not going to get in trouble. Anyway, so 4 years ago I wrote, and it was brilliant, so I'm saying it again. In 1976, Barbara Jordan told the delegates of the Democratic National Convention that Americans are a people in a quandary about the present. We are a people in search of our future. We are a people in search of a national community. Jordan, who was then a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Houston, Texas, the first African-American and the first woman to address a national political convention, went on to say that we are a people trying not only to solve the problems of the present, but we are attempting on a larger scale to fulfill the promise of America. Our political rhetoric should help foster that community and realize that promise. It should speak to the idea that all people are created equal. Our union will never be perfect. People are not perfect. Perfection is the end of democracy. Our union can, however, be more perfect. We can and should strive for a stronger American community. The American community I was raised to believe in, the one I learned about at St. Thomas's Day School in New Haven, Connecticut, the one that was fostered in my home, is a humble community. It's a community that, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, that prays not that God is on our side, but that we are on his. It is a community that fosters freedom and responsibility, that encourages debate and is rooted in respect, that never says anyone is less than because of what they look like, who they pray to, who they love, or how long their family has happened to live inside our map. Nearly 25 years after Jordan's speech, the philosopher Richard Rorty wrote that we should face up to the unpleasant truths about ourselves, but we should not take these truths to be the last word about our chances for happiness or about our national character. Our national character is still in the making. Later in the same work, a book called Achieving Our Country, Rorty wrote, you have to be loyal to a dream country rather than to the one in which you wake up every morning. All good, throwing abstract, whatnot, Monday night talk, blah, blah, blah. Everyone agrees everyone else ought to behave better because, of course, we're all good people. We're all behaving well all the time. It's those other knuckleheads that are a problem. And if I'm behaving badly, it's because they made me. So let's talk about specifics. What we need to do with political rhetoric is talk politics. We need to talk the politics into being that you want. If politics is talk, if rhetoric is democracy, we construct it every time we talk about politics. So construct the politics you want. The politics I want is one that moves us towards a more perfect union, that makes us whole, if not one. It's a politics that knows that most people, most of the time, are doing the best they can for what they think are good reasons. I want a politics that gives me the benefit of the doubt, that gives me the opportunity to change my mind and to learn. As a practical matter, that means encouraging people to vote, not making it harder to vote. It means accepting election outcomes and working with a person you beat or lost to advance shared values. It means not calling your political opponents evil. It means not saying entire groups of people should be wiped out because of their political party. It means supporting free press even when it makes you angry. It means not attacking your opponents for their race or gender or if they have a disability or if they weren't born in the US. It means putting policy out of politics. It means telling the truth. It means condemning election violence, whether it is assassination attempts, threats to poll workers, or setting fire to ballot boxes in Oregon. It means increasing trust in rather than baselessly attacking democratic institutions. It means listening, really listening to understand. I've lived this. I managed a congressional campaign in the mid-1990s that was one of the most hotly contested House races in the country. My boss wasn't perfect. He's still in Congress. He's still not perfect. Our opponent was a good guy. The campaign manager and I would call each other just about weekly to check in, to make sure things weren't going completely off the rails, and occasionally complain about the only people who could gossip to each other about each other's candidates and their respective family members, which is a story maybe not for now in public consumption. A couple days after the election, he and I got together and had lunch. We traded stories. We compared notes. My boss won by a lot. We went on and did the thing. First guy I worked for in Congress was a Democrat from Tempe, Arizona. I was in grad school at Arizona State. My boss then ran for the US Senate, and a friend of mine then ran for his House seat. My boss lost, my friend lost. I knew the guy who beat my friend a little bit. He was one of the only people I knew in Washington. When I moved to Washington to work in the Senate after the failed campaigns, the first person I went and saw was the Republican congressman who beat my boss, because he was the guy I knew, and we had a terrific chat, and he welcomed me to town. He said, whatever you need, let me know. And I'd see him on and off over the years. That's the politics I want. It's a passionate partisan politics, means finding all the available means of persuasion in a given situation. That means finding and telling compelling stories, framing issues in ways that highlight your strengths. It means connecting your issues to voters and to their values. It means respecting voters and taking seriously their fears, their anger, their hopes, and their dreams. It's up to us. Us, through our rhetoric, our politics, and our democracy, to make and remake our democracy every day. Political rhetoric owes democracy everything, because our democracy is our political rhetoric. The challenge is upon us to live it. Thank you. All right, so now what happens?
Oh, thank you, Peter. Does anyone have any questions for Peter? Yeah.
Thank you so much. So,
Okay. Is there like a half asleep undergraduate who could lead this rather than the president of the university? Maybe.
Peter, that was just fantastic. Thank you so much. So let's think about next week.
Yes, ma'am.
And it probably a few days after the election, we find out who's going to be the president. Do you recommend that all academic institutions have a message ready to go to share with their campus and community? And what would that message look like?
Is your VP of Comms in the room? Because I don't want to get. That's a really good question, President Hendricks. Thank you. I don't know that we should have a message ready. I think universities are a little risk averse about messages after the past year or so. But I do know that all universities should be doing what you were doing here, what you were leading here with a year of civility, was saying the election is over. There is a winner. We are together as a community here at Shepherd. We are together as part of the community of the Panhandle in West Virginia and the larger United States. So it is now upon all of us, whether your preferred candidates, one for governor, president, senate, whatever, to work together to find common solutions to shared problems. The challenges of paying for a higher education, right? The problems of economic development here in this part of the country. The ongoing crisis, the ongoing opioid crisis has touched so many families, and so many here in West Virginia more than in other parts of the country. I don't think it's a statement. I think it's a way of being in the world. And I think you're doing that, and you're leading that here, as is Bill Stubblefield and the folks at the Stubblefield Institute. At GW, we have a new president, a woman named Ellen Granberg, and she's been there for a year and a half now. Took over last July. And we've committed as well to democratic dialogue. She's sponsoring a series of panel discussions, bringing faculty from across the university to talk about immigration, the economy, the election. I'm actually I'm giving a very that's who I'm talking to tomorrow night. Not this speech. I'm going to say no. The campaign's still tied. Is what we're going to do. But I think it's up to all of us to live it and be it, and not just on a Monday night, but in our classrooms, in our churches, at the farmers market, we got to figure out how to be together. Like, stuff's got to get done. I grew up in democratic politics, so there's a lot about President Trump I really don't support. But that doesn't change the fact that I need electricity and my water needs to be clean, and I got to drive back to DC tonight. So these are problems. Let's fix these problems, right? And I don't know that there's a Democratic road or Republican road. There's a nice piece of pavement that I'm going to be going down, and let's focus on that. Let's focus on our shared humanity. Let's focus on this idea that America's not perfect, but if we get lucky and get it right, maybe we'll get there. So I don't know if it's a statement so much as it is a way of being. That's a really good question, President. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Peter, you're
For heaven's sakes. Again, the half-asleep freshman.
Yeah, that's right. Peter, you've highlighted the history of politics, highlighted the history of rhetoric, and you mentioned that we've had a very uneven history, some very rough times, and some times we're together. You have the perspective of being a historian and can put in some boundaries. Many of us do not have that perspective. We see what we're seeing today, and there's some passion. The rhetoric is very passionate. The rhetoric is vitriol. The rhetoric is damaging. The rhetoric is very demeaning. Do you see optimism that we can come out of this froth and achieve some sense of partnership like we've had in times past?
A good question you also asked at dinner, and I did not have a better answer on the drive over. First of all, to the historian piece, I'm not, in fact, a historian. I'm a political hack who got lucky, but I am as old, and I've been around for a long time. I'm reminded every day in my classes that my political career is their political history. That thing they read about in high school, yeah, I was there for that. I am optimistic, and as I said at dinner, part of the optimism is probably just self-defense. I'm getting older. I'm being the vice president of the same age, which is both alarming and cool, but also kind of alarming. And I'm not at this point in my life going to say, you know what, it's all been a failed mission, because then I'd never get off the sofa. So part of my optimism is just I got to get up in the morning. Part of my optimism is I work in politics. I think it can get better. And I've worked with Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans I like and who make me laugh and who are super smart, and Democrats who make me crazy, and vice versa. You can't work in politics and not be optimistic, because the point is to make things better. So you got to believe. If you're going to politics because you want to get rich or famous, honestly, you've been misled. You know, you do it because you believe in something. You believe you can make that change. The other reason I'm an optimist is because I'm a college professor. You can't teach and not be optimistic. I got to think there's something that one of your professors can say to you that makes you go, huh, I hadn't thought about that. I'll go into medicine. I can cure that, right? Or I hadn't thought, I'll go into public service. I'll go work at NOAA. What a fantastic thing to do. You have to be optimistic to be a professor. I also firmly believe, all this stuff I said, I believe. Wow, that's long. There's big font though, right? We invented this. This is a crazy idea, right? We wander around as if democracy makes sense, as if it was always here. It wasn't, right? Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and the other founders were kids, and they said, we're gonna do this new thing. And they stole from the Iroquois. They stole John Adams. Any of you, and I'm going to go way out on a limb. Are any of you familiar with the Basques? Thank you. I got like a nod and a half. Yes. So in Bilbao, which is the big city in the Basque country, there's a bust of John Adams on a major pedestrian thoroughfare near the Guggenheim. Big shopping, there's a bust of John Adams. Because John Adams, when he was traveling through Europe trying to raise money and support for this wacky revolution and new idea of a country we were going to have, was supposed to sail out of Spain, but his ship got waylaid or it was wrecked or something, and they said, look, you can either wait for a new vessel, or we can go inland to this port in this town called Bilbao, and you can get passage out of Bilbao. The Basques were known for sailors, built sailing ships and whalers and this kind of thing. And so Adam said, fine, just get me out of this friggin' country, right? Did not like Spain, hated Spain, winds up in Bilbao, and decides he loves the Basques because the Basques have a notion of democracy and democratic rule. Didn't like parts of it. Parts of it were racist, and they had a king, and John Adams wasn't really pro-king at that point in his career. But there were parts of the participation that, oh, this is really cool. I'll write this down. And that winds up as part of our founding documents. Part of our founding documents exist because a guy raising money got shipwrecked and hated the country he was stuck in. We talked our way here. The institute that you founded, that your vision has led to, is civil political communication. Being civil is an act of being together. Politics is being together, and that's all communication is. We talked our way here. We can talk our way better. Some of it's structural. I think gerrymandering is a problem. I think ranked choice voting could be helpful. Gang primaries could be helpful. I think we can do a better job of teaching politics, teaching debate, teaching rhetoric. But yeah, you can choose. Like, you wake up every morning, you got a choice. Is everything awful and getting worse? Or is everything on balance pretty good and maybe it can get better? All of those statements are true, depending on what you count and where you look. And some days I wake up and I think this morning I was tired. Arsenal tied Liverpool, which is not my preferred result. DC United didn't make the playoffs again. I could have woken up and said, you know what, to the heck with all of y'all. And I thought, you know what, actually, I've got a pretty cool gig. Right? I met with students this morning. I talked to some reporters today. I think it's fun. It's good. It doesn't mean anything, but it feeds my ego, and I'm shallow, so sure, I'll take that. Makes my dad happy. Hey, I was in Newsweek. Oh, you were in Newsweek. Yeah, nobody reads Newsweek, but look, I was in Newsweek. And then I get to drive to a really pretty place to talk to interesting people and have dinner with friends. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to get up and do it again. We have a choice. So yeah, I'm optimistic. Jesus.
This is an easy one.
Yeah, says the chair of the political science department.
So how do we move the rhetoric from winning to governing?
That is not an easy question. That's a challenge, right? I mean, there's the famous line that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And we've entered a period of the permanent campaign, right? I have long believed that governing and campaigning are two sides of the same piece of paper. Campaigning is how you're explaining how you're governing and why you should govern. So we have to govern together, right? And how do we move a rhetoric that gets us together? Part of that is members of Congress, frankly, just putting down their knives every now and again. Part of it is structural things they do together. There's a problem solvers caucus in Congress, which I understand actually works. I find problematic because the point of Congress is to be the problem solvers caucus, right? It's like going to a dentist office in the middle of a dentistry to get your butt, but it's a thing. There's a lot of bipartisan work being done in Congress that gets fewer headlines. I think there are some structural things that have changed since the 90s that made things bad that I think we can make things better. For example, when I was a kid, which is awful to say, but before 1995, Congress was in session much more, and members of Congress would move their families back to Washington, and they spent a lot of time in Washington. Their kids would go to school together, you carpool, and on a Friday night, if you're a member of Congress, you're working late, you're reading the briefing materials, whatever, your staff has gone out, you hang out with the only people left on your hall, and those are other members of Congress. And you can complain about your staff. They never complained about my staff. It was the other members of Congress who complained. But you talk things through. You become people. right? Former Speaker Gingrich changed that with changing the congressional schedule, and he atomized Congress, so they're further apart, but I know there are efforts to bring them back together again. I think that is one way we do it. The other way you would do it, this isn't on them. Like, we are the grown-ups in the room. Why won't those people do something? Who are you talking about? Which people? I'm it. I'm that guy. I informally, because I'm the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, that's always informally, all pro bono, not for money, I advise political campaigns and political candidates. I talk to the press. Like, I'm that guy. You are teaching these people how to behave in politics. You are leading a university of smart, interesting people. You want to change it, that's on us. That means all of you who are dyed-in-the-wool Republican, who hate a candidate, don't vote for him. You can't bring yourself to vote for the Democrat, that's fine, because of policies on, I don't know, abortion or trade or guns or whatever. Write in somebody, run for office yourself. Right? Political elected officials, candidates, do what the rest of us do. That's they behave their incentives. We do what we're rewarded for. We avoid things we think are going to be punished for. Those of you who are students know this story very well. Your professors will say, be bold, take intellectual risks, take a class outside of your major, but don't you dare get a B, because then you'll never get a good job or go to law school. Like, all right, I'll take the easy, I won't do what I'm told, I'll do what I'm rewarded for, right? Elected officials can't get more elected, they can only get unelected. If you win a campaign with 51% of the vote, you were just as much a member of the Congress as if you won with 75% of the vote. You want people to stop behaving like nutters? Vote them out of office. If you think somebody is good and compelling and smart and talks about politics in ways that you want politics talked about, even if you don't fully agree with them, support them. I've given money to 2 candidates who I knew wouldn't win. One I wasn't sure I wanted to win. One of them was Danielle Allen, because I like how they talk about politics. And if you're going to stand up, and she also has a PhD in philosophy and wrote a doctoral dissertation on Platonic justice. I just have a crush on Danielle Allen, is what I'm saying. It's really, people, married couples joke about hall passes, and it's, Sigourney Weaver or something. Mine's a political philosopher, which is as sad as it sounds, to be honest. But I wrote her a check, because I thought, like, if you're going to talk about politics this way, somebody's got to stand up and say, yeah, more of this, please. We got to do the thing, right? It's not hold your nose and vote. It's vote for somebody else. It's take a stand against your party. I have argued with members of my party when I thought they've been wrong. I just don't. You got to do the thing, I guess. I don't know. What do you think? That's not an answer. Are you also an official here at
No,
Shepherd?
I'm a junior.
Thank goodness. You
Yeah.
could have started there.
I wanted to sort of go back to something that you were saying earlier about the Republican in Arizona,
Yeah.
right? Or the Republican from Arizona,
Yeah.
sort of.
A guy named Matt Salmon. He's a former member of Congress now.
Sure. And him welcoming you into DC, right? And this idea of like, I'm a junior here, right?
Yeah.
I'm 20 years old. I was born in 2004, right?
You're-
Like this is my life, right?
I'm with you.
This
I'm
is the
with you.
context.
Yeah.
So how, for me, as someone who is like, someone who is dating someone who is trans, someone who considers themselves queer, someone who has very close friends, not that it matters all that much, but a very close friend of mine is a political science major here, and she is Black and she is queer, and you're talking about how we just need to enter the conversation, but what happens when we are blocked out of the conversation because of our identities, because we are trans, or because we are Black, or because we are lesbians?
Right.
What happens then, especially for the younger folks, and how? And I try so hard not to be disillusioned in these conversations, right?
Yeah.
Because I do ultimately believe that there is something here, because there has been progress before my life to the point where I can sit here now and I can say, like, yeah, I'm a butch lesbian, right? And I can say that to a room full of people and hopefully walk out of it with no one glaring at me. And it's just like, and I want to be able to talk about it with my peers, but so often the response is, how are we going to do that? You know, and it's frustrating for me to listen to other people say, you know, like, there is bipartisanship when it feels like there isn't any for those of us that don't fit the box.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I'm really glad you asked that. Thank you. And it's incredibly hard. I mean, I'm stupid lucky, right? I'm a recently middle-aged white guy from New England who went to a private college and works at a private university. I get to say whatever I want, right? And my career's not behind me, but pretty well settled. I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is, if democracy is about being together, we gotta figure out ways to be together, and you need to be with people where you feel safe and welcomed. We all need that, and for some of us it's easier than others because I walk into a room and nobody's second guessing me. That isn't true of a lot of my friends or a lot of my peers. But I think we have to enter spaces and also help and take people where they are, right? I think most people most of the time want to be good, and maybe find ways to be good with them, right? Maybe find ways to not talk about things that don't matter. Argue about, you know, Blue Moon versus pizza. Again, I'm celiac, right? That's the whole pizza thing, right? But maybe it's that shared humanity, and you're never going to have this kumbaya moment, right? But there could be a moment where, like, okay, look, we're gonna argue, and you know, you're gonna vote for your candidate, so I'm gonna vote for mine, and I'm gonna advocate for gender affirming care, and you're gonna advocate against that, and I think you're advocating against it's reprehensible, but the walk needs to be shoveled. So maybe we find a way to do that, and maybe through that we find a way to be better together, right? I come back to Danielle Allen a lot on this, because again, her bio, as she tells it, is she grew up in a pretty conservative household in Southern California, and she is a black woman, classicist philosopher at Harvard. She checks every box for being the only one in a room. And she finds ways to find a shared humanity. She wrote an astonishing book. She wrote a number of astonishing books. One is called Cuz, about her cousin who took a different path and I think died in jail. One of her books is Talking to Strangers, where she says she was at University of Chicago, and it was all this area, it was all Aristotle and Plato and whatnot, and she thought, this is crazy, I got to go live this. So she went and volunteered, and she taught English as a second language to new immigrants, and she had them read the Declaration of Independence. Again, relatives were enslaved. One of her relatives was tricked into being enslaved. She has every reason to resent everything. And she said that she'd never really closely read the Declaration before. She'd read it enough to get by in class, right, to succeed as a junior at wherever she was in college, and, you know, on the PhD comprehensive exams. But reading it through the eyes of people for whom this was magical and new helped her see the American promise in different ways. So maybe it's a bit of that. My concern is, and all the issues you touched on touch my family as well. My concern is, if we don't find ways to at least be together some of the time for some things, we're toast, I think. I don't know. I don't have a great answer, but that's the best I got. And I know it's so, to put this in further perspective, then I'll stop, because it's obviously, I think about this a lot. So last spring, we've got a very generous donor who endowed a speaker series at GW. And every semester, or once or twice a year, we bring in some big deal person and be bipartisan. And it's a version of this, but with actually impressive people. Senator Cory Booker, for example. He's much better looking and smarter than I am. And we had Governor Spencer Cox come in. And shortly before we invited him, he'd vetoed anti-trans legislation as governor of Utah. Between the invitation and the speech, he'd signed legislation restricting gender-affirming care for minors. A lot of our students are very angry about that. and angry at me because I'm the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs. It wasn't my decision. I didn't have any say in it, but I never said anything about it. I didn't issue a statement. I teach a course on political communication ethics. Several students in my class, confronted me and said, why did you do this? This is wrong. I said, Frank Cesno is the one who invited him. It's a Cesno series. Frank was Washington Bureau Chief for CNN for a long time. He's still in my department. So Frank came and sat down and talked to the students. And I came into the building one morning, and I've got a chief of staff, and she was distraught because somebody had taken, it's really interesting art actually, a body. It was a skeleton of a body, cut it. We have a big wall on the first floor of my building, and they'd written on it in interesting typeface about humanity, about fascism, about people, about recognizing each other shared humanity, and it taped it along these walls, and it was massive. It was the size, once all taped up, it was the size of this set of curtains. And my chief of staff said, what do I do with this? It's in my office. It's not pinned to the walls. I have a small office. And, but it's on a pile on my windowsill, and I see it all the time. And I want it in part because I think it's super interesting, and in part to remind myself to pay attention. That works. It helps. So this is, I don't know if I have an answer, but I encourage you to keep struggling with it. I'm struggling with it. It's easier for me than for you, but I encourage you to keep struggling. Terrific question. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Let's give Peter a round of applause. Then I hope you all join us for dessert out in the reception.